Okay, so it's only January and this is an election year. The American election cycle, of course, is a long process. Uh, there's primaries to go to, caucuses, but I think unless something really drastic happens, this year is almost certainly going to be a rerun of Trump versus Biden. And I think that's bad for American democracy. I think both parties have the wrong candidate. Um, but particularly Trump. I'm going to put my cards on the table here. I'm not neutral. I definitely think Biden's a better candidate. He's not a perfect candidate. I've got some issues with Biden, but I think Trump is toxic. And I think that the implications of this could be very, very serious indeed. I'm going to work through this and explain why I have this position. I may have not. It's not a new thing. Anyone who's been following my channel for a while will know that I'm no fan of Trump. But he's like a stink that won't go away. He's always in the news, and I think throughout this election year that's going to be the case. I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about this regularly, so I'm going to say quite a lot in this video just so that I don't have to for a while. Um, Ron DeSantis has dropped out of the Republican race. Not overly surprising. There was a point last year where it looked like he could have been a serious challenger to Trump. That's fizzled out. Usually early in an election cycle, that's the case. There are a few aspects of this that I can't quite get my head around. One of them is that you have a candidate who has ongoing legal situations. I don't know how he can actively campaign in those circumstances. Now, everyone's entitled to due process, including Donald Trump. But I just find it strange that, someone can have a high profile campaign whilst there's ongoing legal investigations against him. I mean, maybe I haven't followed extensive, maybe the New York proceedings have wrapped up. Maybe I've missed something. But put it this way, if you had a sports person, an athlete who had a serious allegation against them, um, they could miss an event. In the case of a boxer, a big fight. In the case of an athlete, some championship tournament. Um, Now, in the case of, I don't even want to call Trump a politician, but in the case of someone who's in public life in that way, um, I think there's a lot of question marks about the American system. I mean, the Trump situation shows that as long as you have enough money and a big enough mouth, you could basically get to the top. All you have to do is basically get past the Presidential Exploratory Committee. I mean, there have been a couple of other presidents who had no political experience prior to the job. Eisenhower is one example. But Dwight Eisenhower was much more of a statesman than Donald Trump is. And I think he was much more informed about the world than Donald Trump is. Um, and Eisenhower's among the top 10 presidents. No president is perfect. You'll get flaws in all of the records. But with Donald Trump, I do believe he's the worst president in my lifetime by far. I think he's possibly the worst president ever. There's only a couple that would really vie for that title. Andrew Johnson has to be up there for rolling back the civil rights legislation that Lincoln had passed in the Civil War. James Buchanan's often blamed for not preventing the Civil War, although to be fair, I think that a few presidents would share that position. Franklin Pierce and some of the others, they all, the slavery issue was burning throughout those years of the 1850s, bleeding Kansas and so on. Anyone who's had a look at mid-19th century American history will know the situation there. Warren Harding's administration was notoriously corrupt, but Harding was personally popular. Richard Nixon will forever be known as the president who was forced to resign, and very corrupt, very controversial figure. George W. Bush was controversial, but no president, none, has actually incited his own supporters to attack the Capitol. That's never happened. Even Jefferson Davis, a Confederate president, didn't get to Washington And the last time you have to go back to say basically an attack on the U.S. Capitol was the British when we burned the White House in 1814. That's no exaggeration. That's how far back you have to go, over 200 years ago. Now, I know American conservatives say that January 6th is overblown and they're probably tired of hearing about it. Part of me even thinks that CNN is a bit obsessed by it, like they've given too much coverage to that. But you have to look at the implications of what that meant. 5 people died. There's been far deadlier days in American history. Of course, there have. Take any mass shooting that Trump has done next to nothing about. But it's the implications of a defeated presidential candidate, a defeated president in that case, basically inciting his supporters. Now, I think that everyone's responsible for their own actions. And, the people that rioted or were involved in the insurrection or whatever you want to call it, they were adults, so they are responsible for their own actions. And it's right that some of them are serving long prison sentences. But I don't see how you can divorce Donald Trump's pushing of conspiracy theories, his rhetoric, his refusal to accept defeat, all of the positions he took. Now, he didn't say to supporters, go and storm the Capitol. He didn't use those words. But I think you'd have to be just in complete denial to pretend that Trump has no influence on his supporters. That's delusional. It's just nonsensical. Leading politicians have an influence on the actions of their supporters. Goes without saying, and I'm reluctant to call Trump a politician, but that to me is a very lazy argument to suggest that Trump, oh well, he didn't tell them to do it, and of course he condemned it after the fact. He took his time, but these people were going through the Capitol shouting, "Hang Mike Pence," because they saw Pence as a traitor to their dear leader. And I think with Trump, you have more than support for a candidate. I think it has all the hallmarks of a personality cult akin to dictatorships. Now, I think it's a little bit lazy to just say, oh, Trump's a new Hitler. I don't think he is. Um, he hasn't started a world war. He hasn't sent people to concentration camps. So that's a little bit of, we should avoid those sort of analogies. But unquestionably, there are elements of Donald Trump that are, I would say he is a wannabe dictator. I think there are elements of Trump that are very disturbing in terms of what that would mean for American democracy. Bear in mind, this is a man who's lost 3 times now. Trump's a serial loser. He lost the 2016 popular vote. Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump. Now, he won the Electoral College vote. That's a controversial thing in the American system. I know the Democrats for years have called for that to be reformed. Long before Trump, they've been calling for that. Somewhat similar to the AV thing here. It's not the same, but it's those who've called for electoral reform in the UK make the same argument about it not taking each individual vote into consideration. But anyway, he lost the popular vote in 2016. He lost the popular vote in 2020. Joe Biden, for all the slurs about Sleepy Joe got more votes than any politician in American history. That's the reality. And Trump lost the Electoral College vote in 2020 as well. So, it was a decisive loss, despite his attempts to, overturn and interfere with the process in Georgia. I mean, that to me in itself should be grounds for him not even being allowed to run for office again. The fact that he tried to interfere in the democratic process. There are some on the right. I saw Rod Liddell in the, I think it was the Sun. He claimed he's not a Trump supporter. I have to be honest. I think some right wingers now who were Trump apologists are now sort of claiming that they're not fans of Trump. And, someone whose positions I quite respect in some areas is another example. Whose name? Douglas Murray, I was looking over there because I got a brain freeze and I didn't want to start the video over again. Yeah, Douglas Murray's another example. He had a piece in the Sun saying if Biden wins, America goes into decline. If Trump wins, America burns. So he's a late convert, but even he's seeing now the dangers of Trump. I think there's a lot of people on the right who are now embarrassed by their former support for Trump, and they see him for what he is, finally. They've taken their time, but they have. But there is still a disturbing number of conservatives that defend the man. Um, but yeah, I mean, the implications of this are profound because either way, it's bad news. If Trump loses again, we've already seen, this isn't speculation, this isn't conjecture, we have already seen that there are hardcore Trump supporters who are willing to use violence. Now, the fact that some of those people have been jailed subsequently doesn't matter because there's others out there. I saw one report about a young man who escaped with his mother. His father was a so-called oath keeper, really wrapped up in the survivalist stuff and really a big fan of Donald Trump. And the son described him as a psychological terrorist. I think these people are unhinged, quite frankly. Now, there is a school of thought that says, oh, we need to respect all opinions and Trump supporters just need to be listened to. I don't really accept that, and this is why. Um, I get that, vilifying the other side in political discourse isn't a way to win arguments and it isn't a way to convince them that you're right. But when people are prepared to use violence, when they refuse to accept democracy, as far as I'm concerned, then they don't deserve respect. When they're, willing to um, basically threaten other people, when they're willing to, or when they don't accept democracy, why should it be up to moderates? Why should it be up to everyone else to sort of get them to see the error of the ways? I think they need to be held to account. If they engage in violence, they should be arrested. And the same applies to the far left. The Democrats aren't squeaky clean in this regard. During the whole racial tensions of 2020 around George Floyd, there were senior Democrats who were fanning the flames, no question about it. And they also, they're culpable. But the reason Donald Trump stands out is because of his status. He's a former president of the United States. Now, I think Joe Biden has been too comfy with the woke left. I think he's not Bernie Sanders. He's not as far left as that, but he has pandered to the woke left. And that would be, if I was an American, I'd have those concerns the way I would with Keir Starmer. But I think overall, Biden's probably centre left. I don't think he's far left. I think he's probably centre left. And his record shows that. The positions he's taken over the years, he's certainly not loony left. I would say he's centre left. And he's one of the most experienced candidates ever in terms of his office experience. Now, the big flaw with Biden, as I see it, is unfortunately his age does show sometimes. He's 81 and sometimes he looks it. Um, I'm not talking necessarily in physical health, but in terms of stumbling his words, sometimes, this might sound ageist, but sometimes he looks like an old man. And unfortunately, that will play into Trump's hands, even though Trump's only 4 years younger. Trump is not a young man either. They'll have a combined age of um, what would be, if my maths is right, well over almost 160, which is by far the oldest candidates ever. Um, but the some of the things that the Republicans attack Biden on are just ridiculous. Not just Republicans. I've seen conservatives elsewhere. I've seen British conservatives attack Biden on some ridiculous things. GB News, for example, they were having a go at Biden because he didn't attend the coronation last year. Well, they failed to mention that the Republican, Eisenhower, didn't attend Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. It's just not done. No American president has ever attended a British royal coronation, ever. And no British monarch has ever attended an American presidential inauguration. So it's an example of stoking up a controversy where really there is none. Um, Sky News Australia is the same. They're constantly taking jibes at Biden and constantly being cheerleaders for Trump. It's pathetic and it's very obvious. Now, I'm not saying that Biden shouldn't be criticised, but when they're so ridiculously biased, it's just glaringly obvious. Um, but I really think whatever happens is toxic. I mentioned if Trump loses, his supporters may well resort to violence. I think it's very, very plausible because no doubt he will push out conspiracy theories. I do not. I really find it hard to believe that if he loses again, he'll just go quietly into the night and accept it. We know from history that his ego, his narcissism, doesn't allow that. It didn't happen in 2021. Why would it happen in 2025? Now, if Trump actually wins, and we shouldn't rule that out, you know, um, incredible as it seems, this man who has so many criminal allegations against him, so much controversy, so much association with violence, so much, disregard for democracy, he could actually have a chance of becoming president of the United States again. If that happens, I don't know what a second Trump presidency will look like exactly, but we have some idea. I think he will be vindictive. He'll deny this. Um, he'll say one thing and then do another. He'll deny it, then he'll double down and reiterate the point. This is typical Trump. Like implying that he would be a dictator, then claiming he wouldn't be, and just it's typical Trumpian bombast. But I think that if he wins, I don't know what form that will take, but I think he'll go after the Democrats hard. I think he'll try and spend a good bit of his presidency getting revenge on Biden and senior Democrats. Now, some say that's what the Democrats are doing now, but the thing about those legal cases is, some will say it martyrizes Trump, but there's a very simple principle. Why should anybody be above the law? Why the hell should Donald Trump be above the law? That should be a question for his supporters. Why should he be above the law? He's an American citizen, is he not? Why should he be above the law? I mean, it's not Joe Biden sitting in the dock and judging Donald Trump. It's not Nancy Pelosi. It's judges. So this notion that it's a witch hunt, I don't buy it. In terms of Colorado and I think the other one was Maine taking Trump off the ballot. It may be misguided because it may well, turn him into a martyr, a status he absolutely does not deserve. I think the rationale is actually quite reasonable. Trump's violated the Constitution, so why should he be able to stand an election? The problem is in the minds of his supporters and his apologists, it makes him the victim. Oh, and it's not democratic to not let him stand. Um, I was talking about, supporters of Trump in the UK. I mentioned Rod Liddell in The Sun. He said, yeah, he mentioned that, it's not democratic to not let him stand. Um, but let's say, even leaving aside domestic vindictiveness, I think the implications for Ukraine could be profound. Trump has strongly suggested he would get peace by, I think what he will do is withdraw funding to put pressure on the Ukrainians to basically secede a huge part of their territory. And my question to Trump supporters is, how would you feel if a foreign power was to just take Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Louisiana, for example, and say they belong to their country? And, you should just accept it for the sake of peace. That's essentially what Trump would be asking the Ukrainians to do, because you'd be absolutely sure that a tyrant like Putin will not stop. And given half a chance, he would target the Baltic states, Moldova. Um, so I think it would send out a very toxic message. I mean, that sort of peace is not worth the price, asking people to sacrifice. The Ukrainians are not loving war. I'm sure they want the war to end. But I think if you ask the average Ukrainian of a choice between continuing this defensive war or basically giving up your country and basically having servitude to Russia, I think they would choose to continue the war. Rishi Sunak was apt when he said this is a 1942 moment. Now, Boris Johnson's come out of the woodwork to claim that Trump wouldn't do that. Well, frankly, I don't trust Boris Johnson. I don't trust either of them. Um, and if this is, his supporters might even say, oh, this is just to put pressure on them, or, I mean, what does that tell you about the man? The fact that he is willing to send out that message to the courageous Ukrainian people whilst they fight for the country. The Ukrainians can't afford 10 months of uncertainty, you know? Um, so I think if Trump was to do that, if he was to withdraw funding from Ukraine, it would be a complete failure of American leadership. And I honestly think if that were to happen, I think it would change America's position in the world. Technically, the US would still be the most powerful country in terms of having the biggest economy. But I think if that happens, America loses the right. If President Trump, a second President Trump, was to, abandon a country struggling against a powerful tyranny and an adversary of the United States, to just, give it up, I think America would have no right to call itself um, the leader of the free world. In terms of certainly Trump can't call himself that. I'm not saying there's any other leader that would automatically fill that mantle, but it sure as hell would not be Donald Trump. Um, there is this undercurrent of so-called Red Caesar. I don't know where that's going. A sort of uh, it's like a kind of cold word that apparently some of his hardcore supporters are using to hope that he gets back into power. I think I don't know. I think this is going to be a very ugly election, probably the worst ever in terms of the mudslinging. And I think Biden has to be very careful not to stoop to Trump's level. I think he needs to focus on policies and Trump's failures and Trump's contempt for democracy as well. I don't know what's the best strategy that Biden's side can use if Trump does become the nominee. Um, because the problem is reminding people of January the 6th. Unfortunately, clearly Trump supporters don't care. And that's sad, but they don't care. So unfortunately, that wouldn't be enough. I think one thing Biden can do is pitch much more to the center ground. I think if the Democrats continue, pushing identity politics and pandering to the woke left, they will polarize floating voters. They'll polarize the center ground, and some of them may even be tempted to vote for Trump. Now, I think that's a big mistake, but it's not for me to tell them what to do. But I think Biden in this election cycle needs to be much more centrist. In 2020, I think to a large extent his campaign pitched to Bernie Sanders supporters on the left. Now that may well be the Democratic base right now, but it's not just the Democratic base they have to win; it's America they have to win. So what Biden needs to do is convince, maybe disillusion Trump voters. That'll be a very hard task, but that's what he will have to do to get re-elected. Um, I could talk about all the things that Trump's come out with over the years, but apparently it's not enough for Trump supporters. You could literally show them, the man saying something from his own mouth, from his own lips, and they would say, "Oh, it's a media witch hunt. It's a media smear campaign." It could literally be his words coming from his mouth, and they will say, "Oh no, it's a smear campaign." And that's very much the hallmark of a personality cult, much like it was with Jeremy Corbyn's supporters here. The difference, of course, is Corbyn never got to be Prime Minister, thank goodness. Um, but, saying, for example, I like people who don't get caught, contemptible. The things that Donald Trump has come out with, I mean, Ronald Reagan, who was once seen as the sort of secular god of the Republicans, he'd be turning in his grave, really. To Reagan's credit, he always stood up to communism. He always stood up to tyranny. I mean, you could argue his record was more patched in terms of the Iran-Contra scandal, but at least he was on the right side of things. With Donald Trump, Trump cannot bring himself to condemn Putin unequivocally. Trump stood beside Putin, and denigrated the American media. It's one thing criticizing them, fine. There's plenty of grounds to criticize the US media on, but to do it at that point, standing beside the Russian dictator, to me is grotesque. And it shows a complete lack of judgment that Trump has on these things. Um, if you want to look at his actual presidency, he achieved next to nothing on gun violence. He done nothing about that problem. Um, America's in massive debt on his watch. He was slow to act on COVID. Um, he didn't take it seriously at first. Finally, he did. I think the Democrats aren't blameless either. They were too PC regarding China. But even when we look at China, okay, if people might say, well, okay, Trump's been consistently tough on China. Even there, he said he thought the Uyghur concentration camp sounded like a good idea, and then he doubled down and changed his stance. But I think when it comes to Donald Trump, there is just too much inconsistency in his positions. Um, and I've no problem with him taking a hard line with China. I think Western leaders need to, but I mean, look at North Korea. He had that much lauded summit, which was technically historic, the first American president to ever do that. But what did it do? I mean, the North Korean regime is as brutal as ever. This week, two teenage boys were sentenced to 18 years hard labor for watching Japanese or South Korean films. you know. So it certainly didn't create a kind of perestroika or glasnost moment. If it did, I would give Trump credit for that. The best I can say regarding his foreign policy is he did get some improved relations between Israel and some of the Gulf states. I'll give him credit for that. Because actually, as much as I cannot stomach Donald Trump, I did say when he becomes president, I'll give him a chance. Maybe he'll have some good policies. But I honestly think everything this man does is self-interested. I think his narcissism, I think his ego, I think his vindictiveness against domestic opponents. Now, Richard Nixon had some of those things, but Nixon was a statesman in a way Trump just isn't. His ignorance about foreign affairs is another case in point. So, with all this being said, there may be reasons that Americans support Trump. It may be because of the culture wars. It may be a lot of factors, and I suspect some of his British, Canadian, Australian supporters are with him on those issues as well. In the case of Indian Trump supporters, because I've seen quite a few of them, I suspect it was because of his anti-Muslim stance. And there's been a rise in Hindu nationalism in India under Narendra Modi. But, if Trump's America gets into some sort of trade dispute with India, they'll soon change their tune. So, um, but I just cannot believe we're in January 2024 and Trump is still a presence. He's still, there's a very real chance he could be back in the White House. I think he'll almost certainly win the Republican race. I don't think Nikki Haley really has a realistic chance now. Um, and frankly, if she is a nominee, I would not at all be surprised if she puts Trump on the ticket as her VP choice, as her running mate, in which case her presidency will be totally overshadowed by Trump. So wherever this man is, he casts a shadow. Um, I think it's a disgrace that the Republican Party are so spineless, with a few exceptions. Mitt Romney, Chris Christie, and a few others. I don't want to give Mike Pence too much credit. He'd done the right thing, but only at the last minute. But he did do the right thing in the end. But there are some Republicans, Chris Christie, Mitt Romney stand out, who have criticised Trump. And, no doubt they've received a lot of animosity for it. But history will show that they were on the right side of democracy. And it is to their credit. I'm going to wrap this up, but it depresses me. It really depresses me to see that this guy is, that so many people can't seem to see what is obvious. Donald Trump is a wannabe dictator. Now, the institutions that are in place in the United States means that I don't think we're necessarily going to see a Trump dictatorship, because I think it'll be just about enough to keep him in check. But, look at his first presidency. Look at the number of resignations there were. Look at how unstable that was. Far more than any other one-term president. So there's so many things that should point to this man's unsuitability for office. And yet people don't seem to care. It's almost like the fact that they see him as a maverick or outspoken or something. Oh, well, we'll just disregard everything else. We'll just disregard the fact that this guy has a contempt for democracy itself. That's staggering. I mean, in 2000, when there was that contentious decision between Bush and Gore, Gore strongly disagreed with the verdict, but he didn't incite his supporters, you know? And Gore had good reason to be upset about that, but he didn't incite his supporters. And there was controversy, but there was no violence. Um, I just think that Trump has really, really toxified the American political landscape. Not alone. I think the woke left also have a lot to answer for, but it depresses me. It really does, because the direction of America will have implications for the rest of the world. And I think we need